Welcome to a special edition of Drinking with Craig and Roger. I'm Roger.
I'm Craig, and this is yet another coronavirus quarantine edition of Drinking with Craig and Roger. We have no other choice, but I think that's fine. We're just reviewing things that we both happen to have at the same time.
Well, I actually went out and bought this because you suggested it.
Did you buy it safely?
Yes, I did. I was able to call ahead and see if they had it, and then drove over and they brought it out to me, and took my credit card away, and then came back with the credit card.
That is awesome. I love it. So hopefully, gladly we were able to review this. I've been seeing a couple things about this. Is a fairly new product from Woodford Reserve, who many people know, obviously. This is their wheat whiskey, right? This is
Absolutely. And you'll notice it says it's proprietary, and this label batch is 26, and this is bottle number 2331 of the batch.
Wow, you got an earlier bottle than me. I got 2626.
Well, I'm sure mine has been aged longer then.
And this is it comes in at 90.4 proof, so about 45% alcohol. So it's got a little more oomph to it than some other we have.
Now, you notice that Woodford Reserve, is famous for bourbon, but this is not a bourbon. This is a wheat whiskey.
Which means,
in case someone is wondering what the difference is, okay, a bourbon must be 51% corn, and it must be aged in first use charred oak barrels. So it gets a lot of the, caramel taste out of the charring in those barrels. Okay, for it to be a straight rye whiskey, it must be 51% rye. For it to be a straight wheat whiskey, it must be 51% wheat. That doesn't mean it's 100% wheat. So it's got the same grains in it, and actually it even says what it has in it here. It has wheat, corn, rye, and barley malt in it.
now, how would you expect that to affect the flavor in general?
Wheat is a softer taste than rye. So the proportion of wheat is very high in this. And so I would expect that it'd be softer on the palate, not as much caramel, and certainly not the zip that you would get if you had, say, 30% rye in it with a little bit of barley malt and the rest corn.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, what about compared to the corn, like the dominant wheat versus the dominant corn? Same notes.
Well, they're all gonna have a good amount of corn in it, if it's a Kentucky made whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
The only other thing that might be affecting it is if it just says whiskey on it and not bourbon whiskey. It can be in a second use barrel.
Right.
So if it held whiskey before it was made, you would maybe get a little bit of the caramel taste from the and the coloring, from the charring, but not nearly as much as you would get if it were a first use one. That's actually why some Scotch whiskeys have a little bourbon taste to them, because they use a barrel that previously had bourbon.
Yeah, why not? And as you can tell, I haven't had this that long, maybe 2.5, 3 weeks. I'm a fairly big fan of it, although it does taste a little different to me every time I have it.
My bottle's fuller than your bottle.
Yeah, you've had it for how? I mean, God, you put a dent in it. How long have you had it? A week, maybe less.
Well, to be honest, I had help with this.
Okay,
I drank some of it.
that's fair. That's fair. So, all right, let's get into it. Let's open.
Absolutely.
Good cork sound there.
I'll put it up where you can see it. Go in there.
I might have poured a little much, but that's fine. Hey, I don't have anything to do. So
Um, I don't think it's quite as orangey brown as a typical bourbon would be. It's a lighter orange,
yeah, it's more of a yellowish orange.
or like a tangerine, maybe.
Tangerine. That is a good descriptor.
Very clear, so obviously they filtered it well.
Very clear, yes. Right, right. I guess maybe it hasn't been aged that long. There's no age statement, so who knows how long it was aged, but it clearly wasn't aged so long.
Oh, probably 3 to 4 years, something like that. Probably, maybe a little bit longer.
All bets are off once they stop calling it. Well, I guess you really don't even have an age requirement.
Oh no, it should be about 3 years to be calling it whiskey. You have to call it spirits if it's younger than that, generally.
Gotcha. All right, let's give the nosing. What do you get?
Okay.
There is a dominant smell of something in there that I have a really hard time identifying.
I'm having trouble identifying that.
Yes, it's a very ominous. It's not ominous. It's very hard to identify. Pleasant, rich smell.
Well, if you've had a white dog whiskey, which is one which is just off the still, okay, there's usually a little nose to that that's and then when you taste it, it's usually kind of a little bit rough, and this sort of smells like a mild version of that. It's been rounded off, but it still has that kind of fresh whiskey aroma, I think.
Definitely has a pronounced alcohol, ethanol smell.
Better ethanol than methanol.
It smells kind of similar to some rye whiskeys that I've had, some of the stronger, like 100 proof rye whiskeys. Well, it's delicious. Breaking
It
down.
is, yeah. Oh, yeah, and you can't really see it on the screen there, but some of these legs go up all up here, which is pretty high.
You're right. It does have long legs.
Long legs.
It's delicious. Now, breaking down what makes it delicious, I find difficult.
It's pretty smooth, so it's been aged long enough. These folks at Woodford Reserve are pretty careful about what they do. If you've been there, it was a distillery founded around something like 1812, and they have some warehouses that are of old stones that aren't perfectly matched that you put together. They've got a couple of warehouses like that and some old buildings. And of course, they have a very new visitor center, but they're very proud of it, and they do a good job. And I'm pretty sure they use copper stills, single-use stills, which is why you can say they've got a batch, because they do it by batch. So,
gotcha. I want to say now this is where me not having had one of those tasting and smelling kits where you have each individual component available to really know what each flavor and smell brings to the table. I want to say I get a very strong cherry note off of this. What do you think about that?
Cherry?
Cherry. Like cherry free, cherry
Maybe.
fruit, stone fruit kind of.
Well, it's definitely, yeah. I think I can taste a little caramel on the bottom of this. So I think it's been in a charred oak barrel, but maybe not a new one.
Okay.
And they can do interesting things. like, here's your batch. You put that whiskey, some of it's in, new oak, charred oak barrels, some of it's in reused ones, some of it's in plain, and then they age it and they blend it together, when they're done. So it's interesting. Um, no, this is very, very smooth going down. It's not a real heavy body, and for 90 proof, it's not as intense as you might expect.
No, I think it tastes a lot smoother and less hot than it smells. And it just has a very, what I would describe as a round flavor. It's hard to to pinpoint individual things in it, but it's quite good. It all comes together for a really nice flavor. And of course, people go crazy for wheated bourbons, heavily wheated bourbons.
Yeah, well, I would guess, the mash bill for this is probably maybe 60% wheat, something around that, not real high, and probably 30% corn, something like that, 25-30% corn, then maybe 5-6-7% rye, and then a little bit of barley malt. They really like to have barley malt in it because the enzymes in the barley malt help it ferment much better than if you don't use that.
Gotcha.
There's almost always a little bit of barley malt in a professional made one.
Yeah, and I think this completes. Woodford wanted to be able to, I guess, brag or have the claim that they now have a whiskey from all four dominant grains. So they have a bourbon, like a corn whiskey. They have the wheat. They have a rye whiskey. And I'm trying to remember, I think the other one is barley. They have a barley whiskey, like each one with that dominant grain in it. So it would be pretty interesting to compare the four. Now, one thing I really want to do, I want to do a blind bottled in bond bonanza. I want to do like 5 or 6 bottled in bond bourbons, blindly tasting them all and really compare and see what we think is the best. I think it would be really fun because, God, bottled in bond whiskey is really good.
Well, it's very intense. Bottled in bond means that the tax on the whiskey has not been paid until it's bottled. So it sits around in the warehouse with the tax unpaid and somebody checking on it, every 3-6 months, make sure nothing's getting lost. And then the government gets its share, when it's bottled. And I'm not sure everybody knows this, but it's entirely possible for 50% of the price you pay for a bottle of whiskey to be taxed. Right. And then it's worse than that. There's your price with excise tax for the federal and the state governments on this, and then you pay sales tax on that tax.
Yeah, I guess that would be why all the scotches are more expensive. Why? Japanese.
Well, that is exactly why you can make beer and wine on your own, but you can't make whiskey because it's taxed so highly that the government would lose a whole heck of a lot if you made it at home.
Gotcha.
So, and in fact, we have the tax on whiskey. Well, actually, what I was going to say is we could owe income tax to the tax on whiskey because before Prohibition, okay, income tax was not a thing. But when they established Prohibition and alcoholic beverages were made illegal, the government lost so much income that they had to pass an amendment, I think it was 16, that allowed for income tax.
Wow.
Now that actually happened before Prohibition, but they did that to be aware of it and ready for it. So then they had income tax to replace that, and then typical of the government, when they repealed Prohibition, they did not get rid of the income tax because that meant the government had even more money from us. So.
Wow. Oh boy. Well,
Anyway,
speaking of money, this bottle is usually about $30. Is that about what you got it for? Do you remember? 30 or 35?
somewhere around there. Yeah, it wasn't much more than that.
Yeah, so it's pretty reasonable, really, especially for what it is. So it's pretty reasonable. Where would you put that in terms of a value? As far as what you recommend?
Oh, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, something like that.
Okay, pretty good value.
I mean, there are whiskeys that are very, 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 very nice that cost a lot less, half of that, and then there are whiskeys that are very, very nice and cost a lot more than that, like a couple $100. So.
That's true. So, but I mean, I think it's fairly unique. So I definitely would recommend trying it. You can't go wrong. I don't see anybody not liking this personally. Do you?
No, it's just more mellow, really. It's more mellow than most bourbons or ryes.
In a lot of ways, yes.
It participates in the feel of them a little bit. It's sort of like that, but it's just a much softer taste.
Yeah, I agree. It's delicious, and obviously we've been plowing through it with no problem. So definitely recommend giving it a try. You kind of can't go wrong. I mean, it might not be your thing, but you're probably still going to like it.
I think so.
Yep.
Well, I think we're going to do a couple more of these things at the distance because we, probably going to be, like this for another month at least, if not longer.
Yep.
Anyway.
So here we go. It's been fun. And the drinks are delicious. So cheers to you. Take care. And everybody at home, take care.
Take care.
And enjoy.
Enjoy.